Welcome back. Now, the ongoing trade war between the U.S. and China is bad news for the global economy. The world's top financial policymakers have admitted it poses a serious risk. Now, today, investment banking company Citigroup warned that S&P 500 is headed for a full-scale bear market. And we've got international relations professor John Stremlau, who joins us to discuss this matter further. Professor Stremlau, thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight. It appears as though trade and geopolitical tensions have actually worsened where the U.S. and, of course, in China are concerned. Talk to us about that.
Well, there's a lot of noise in the airways. There wasn't that much that came out of the G20 finance ministers in Tokyo this weekend, although the ambassador for the European Union said China and the U.S. ought to get their act together. But the big story, Faith, the big story is Donald Trump backing down on the Mexico threat, because that occurred also over the weekend. And that, I think, is reminding all other G20 members, including Cyril Ramaphosa here, that Trump's bark may be larger than his bite, because he really did cave on the Mexicans. The Mexicans gave very little away, but he at the same time demonstrated that he was willing to make these outrageous threats of tariffs when he was already agreeing to a trade deal with Mexico and Canada, and he linked it to immigration, and he made all sorts of demands that were quite unreasonable, and I think all the other G20 countries know this. So going into the Osaka meeting at the end of this month, we may in fact see Donald Trump back down again, but the Chinese aren't going to be pushed around, and nor is South Africa or anyone else.
Well, I think that it just says something about the U.S. stance in terms of maybe instilling and reinforcing a hegemonic approach to policymaking and a hegemonic approach to how it views never mind America, but also the rest of the world. And it's being heartfelt by ministers across the globe in terms of America's stance at the moment, almost looking as though it's this bully in the playground.
Well, you do have a bully in the White House. The question is whether or not Trump actually reflects the American people. Don't forget the Democrats won in the congressional elections last year, and will he prevail in 2020? I mean, the parallels to South Africa are really quite profound, because we have in this country a public that takes its government rather seriously, and the elections matter. And elections matter in the United States, too. Now, in this trade war, Trump is alienating, even in his own party, which has been very unwilling to criticize him in the Senate, for example. No one liked these tariffs because the American taxpayer was ending up paying for it, despite what Trump said, and there was a threat of a global slowdown, which would impact on the employment and the chance for Republicans to get reelected in 2020. So the party started to split. Mexico was the tipping point, I think, and I think you see Donald Trump increasingly isolated. Whether the Democrats can capitalize on this, whether countries like South Africa can then negotiate with a clear eye on where the U.S. will cave and where it won't cave, because it really is a Donald Trump-dominated system right now. And that's not really what a democracy is all about.
Well, on the other side of it, especially when it comes to South Africa's behalf, does that not then urge South Africa to sway more towards China, especially considering the last investment or investment commitment by China to the African continent? I think it was to the value, I think, of $20 billion that was committed to the continent for the purposes of development. Does that then not soften matters to side with the China?
Well, it makes it a very interesting game. And Nalandi Pandor, when the new foreign minister, head of DIRCO, was briefing her staff, she said, look, you people have to get out there and work hard for South Africa. Every country deserves our attention and our interest, because they can help us and they can hurt us. And China can help or hurt South Africa, as can America. The question is one country going to dominate in Africa? And I don't like the idea of America abandoning Africa, and I don't think the country is abandoning Africa. I think things like HIV/AIDS programs forgive my papers, HIV/AIDS programs and agriculture and power, these things can all be very positive, and they can be complementary to the Chinese involvement. What it takes is South African leadership, as we saw back in the days of Thabo Mbeki, where you put an African position forward, and then you let other countries come and you negotiate. You negotiate.
Well, looking at where South Africa's trade deficit is, and currently, I mean, we'd say that we're importing more than we're actually exporting, but at the back also of investment or investor confidence, which is seemingly very low as a result of policy uncertainty, Professor, one would say that are we not then at almost at a weaker level? I mean, we're talking about how South Africa needs to take charge and take the stance, but all of these mitigating factors, does that not make it difficult for us to take charge and set a South African agenda?
Absolutely. And Cyril Ramaphosa rightly is focused on trying to pull together the team in his new government, and it's very, very difficult, as we all know, and domestic politics does predominate, of course. However, the weakness is going to be more compounded if there is a global economic turndown. And the global economic turndown will be the function of Donald Trump escalating this tariff war unnecessarily. The Chinese need to be held accountable for their policies, of course, but it ought to be done in a multilateral framework. And I think that Cyril Ramaphosa can argue effectively in that regard, but also look for allies among the other G20 countries. It is China, yes, it's important. It's very important for South Africa. And if the China economy slows down, it's bad for our exports. But nevertheless, there is a fluidity now as a result of the emperor being seen to have no clothes in the Mexico deal, if you can take Donald Trump in that context. Now we're in a game where I think other countries are stepping up and realizing they have to work out a formula and a framework for a rules-based international order.
Well, you find the isolation part quite interesting, but we have to leave our conversation there for this evening. Thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight. That was International Relations Professor John Stremlau giving us the latest on the G20 summit.